Okay, good morning. This is Richard Hsu, host of Hsu Untied. This morning, I'm really thrilled to have with me as my colleague and guest, Ed Batts, who's a partner at Gibson. Ed, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Richard. Nice to see you again, and we go fair ways back in the
For
practice of
sure.
the law. So
For sure.
another lesson in a small Silicon Valley at times.
For sure. For sure. Well, Ed, you've got a couple of interesting things in your background that I rarely come across. And starting with your interesting military background, tell me a little bit about how you even decided to go into the military. How'd you choose that as a sort of a career path?
Yeah, sure. So I think like a lot of lawyers, I was a poli-sci major back in the day, and I did a lot of things prior to going to law school that were kind of in the defense and national security area.
Hmm.
After law school, I graduated in '98. Obviously, 9/11 hit pretty shortly after that, and I was pulled into a program they call it a direct commissioning program, but basically, they send you a commission in the mail more or less after some processing and the like. And so my commission date was essentially immediately after 9/11, and I went on from that, and I was with so it wasn't totally out of character as a lawyer, but I was with first the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, NCIS,
Hmm.
which is familiar to some folks via wonderful Hollywood portrayals on TV. And then in 2008, I moved over from NCIS to the Air Force equivalent of that, just because of some reorganizations within DoD. I kept on doing the same job with the same people.
Hmm.
Um, in an interesting way, but I moved over to the Air Force, and I was a special agent with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations, or what's called OSI, until I ended my military career in about 2016. So I had about a 14, 15 year run, whatever it was.
Yeah. And how were you able to do that while practicing law at the same time? Explain how that worked.
Well, so part of it was, big law is an all-in endeavor, as you know.
Yeah.
So part of it was let's put it this way: I've enjoyed the word vacation since 2016 forward. It's been a nice new word in my vocabulary. But prior to that, most of my what otherwise would have been vacation time, because I'm an M&A lawyer, a deal lawyer, and that can be a pretty intensive endeavor if you're doing it right and operating at a relatively high level. And so, I have vivid recollections of being in parking lots outside of secure facilities trying to get term sheets done with other folks. But I also have I started off my career with what at the time was kind of sort of a Silicon Valley boutique, which was Gray Carey, technology's leading edge. And Gray Carey had its roots in both Palo Alto and San Diego being a military town.
Yeah.
And I really have to hand it to the Gray Carey and then DLA Piper folks, for absolutely treating the military reservists and national security
Hmm.
folks with
Huh.
completely golden treatment and
Huh.
really supporting the backbone of that.
Huh.
And as well as when I moved over to Oric had the same attitude. So
Huh.
for juniors, we have a bunch of folks within the military veterans affinity group at Gibson, some of whom are continuing to serve as reservists in various capacities. And I think, the practice of law has recognized the need to kind of balance that and propagate that and encourage it over time. And so I'm impressed with Gibson, and I'm impressed with the firms I was previously with on the level of support that you receive.
Can you talk about what kind of projects you worked on in the military?
Sure. NCIS and OSI do a variety of things. They do all the major felony level investigations,
Hmm.
often in partnership with the FBI at times, depending on the subject matter.
Hmm.
So, you cover the waterfront, the things that are kind of sort of standard, which would be narcotics investigations, sexual assaults, a lot of sexual assault investigations, things of that
Oh.
nature.
Huh.
And then on the flip side, all of my time overseas was actually not in that capacity. It was more liaising with foreign partner forces
Hmm.
and working within a coalition structure to
Hmm.
assist various operating forces.
Which countries were you overseas at?
So I was in a variety of ones, but the ones that are best known and public would be I did 2 tours in Iraq,
Oh,
um,
wow.
which was interesting. I started in the northern part, up along the border in the Kurdish areas and Mosul and things of that. And
Wow.
then I did another tour down in central Iraq around Baghdad.
Hmm.
And then I've been to a number of other places, obviously, as you can imagine, generally speaking, in the Middle East mostly. And then I also, my final formal deployment was to Yemen, and that was right at the cusp as the Houthis came down from the north of Yemen and entered Sana'a and started the civil war that lasts to this day.
Mm.
Where Yemen continues to be cleaved apart into.
Any close calls, harrowing experiences?
I mean, so it's hard to be in those environments in in the military term in a contingency deployed environment and not have stuff. There are people who, I was not a live combat person. I was the person who, usually had a bunch of guys around me who were
Yeah.
protecting. So I have absolutely no complaints about my treatment or anything like that. But, I mean, it's a real deal environment. I mean, it's no secret this, like, the third day I was in Iraq, the vehicle convoy I was in got shot up pretty bad. I was driving a vehicle that got disabled.
Wow.
It's a tough place to be. But I think
Mm.
it's, from a big law perspective, I think it's really important as a society, just from a policy standpoint, that we have people who are integrating, to help, because you see the US military deploy at scale, and it's tens of thousands of folks, a lot of them very young, a lot of them 18,
Yeah.
19 years old. They're looking at the military as a way forward socioeconomically, to get training, to have a job, to get an education, right? And the more that we can integrate and be a team together, I think the better for everyone, including from a social aspect going
Yeah.
forward.
Yeah.
So, I'm thankful that I didn't encounter anything terribly serious. But yeah, I mean, I remember I came back from my first deployment, and it was July. My first weekend home was July 4th of that year, and July 4th with fireworks going off. It wasn't, I was a little hyper vigilant at the time. It was an interesting weekend. Let's put it that way.
Well, what made you decide to enlist in the military in the beginning? Was your dad in the military? Family? Do you have come from a military
No,
family?
like I said, I had done some stuff prior to when I went to law school, and so I was very familiar with the national security environment. And when 9/11 hit, I'd done a lot of things. I went to UCLA undergrad. UCLA actually had a great cooperative program with the Rand Institute, which is a
Mm.
large think tank in Santa Monica that has significant military
Mm.
contracts. And so I had done a lot of things on, for example, the structure of Syria and the various parts of Syria and how Syria works, far before the Syrian civil war and the outcomes that we've seen in the past decade or so.
Yeah.
And so I knew a fair amount of people, and I think when 9/11 hit, there were a lot of folks who said, now's not the time to be completely focused on 100% on the civilian career. You got to kind of balance it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Wow. But I mean, that definitely sounds like an unusual experience for sure.
Yes, although like I said, I think increasingly you see, people who are either veterans who serve for a number of years on active duty, or they're now reservists and they're serving as JAG officers, or we've got former logistics officers. You name it, you run the gamut. Whether they're academy grads or ROTC grads, direct commission folks. There's a number of folks serving out there. It's just I'm not sure it's something that people wear on their sleeves, nor do I try to. It's just
Yeah. Yeah.
something I did.
I'm assuming though you forged a lot of incredible relationships from those days, and you still maintain those.
Yes, I'd say some of my, the bulk of my closest personal relationships are from folks who I served alongside.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
hard not to have those types of bonds, right?
Yeah. I can totally imagine. Interesting. Well, one of the other things you have in your background is that apparently you have some interest in you were part of the American Nuclear Society, which was kind of intriguing. I saw that in your bio. Tell me a little bit about your interest in that and maybe your involvement with that.
Yeah, so nuclear is interesting. I did a deal way ago, maybe 20 plus years ago. There was a time when nuclear was really two parts. It was weaponry, obviously, and then energy. And the energy supply chain was very tightly controlled, and it was a very established technology, one would say, right? If you look at the existing nuclear power fleet that we have in the United States, that technology goes back 50, 60 years now, to when it was first developed. And so I got interested in it because I did a deal in the nuclear supply chain, and it was very fascinating. And at the time, it involved a foreign ally country, close out, one of the Five Eyes allies, as they say, and it involves CFIUS. And back in the day, CFIUS was like not a household name,
Right.
and so I got to work on a CFIUS deal with what ended up being a proxy agreement, where you have a U.S. citizen board, sort of independent of the foreign parent board, helping run the thing, and it was in the nuclear supply chain and nuclear enterprise. And I thought it was very interesting. If you look at our goals, if you take as a given that we want to have clean power, and we want to have clean power for a variety of reasons. It's not just decarbonization in terms of climate change, but you look at electrification of the vehicles, right? Particularly, and I'm a little bit about the climate equity part of this, which is if you look at ports are a great example, right? We're moving towards last mile electric vehicles for our port facilities, whether it's Oakland or Long Beach or whatever. That takes significant amounts of baseload electricity if you're going to do it at scale. And the challenge is if you look at the current grid, something like 40% is natural gas, nat gas, cleaner, but not perfect. 16% is still coal, and only 20% is renewables, and that within the renewables, there's a challenge, obviously, from an availability standpoint. If it's not a windy day or a sunny day or it's nighttime, you've got to have a large battery farm in order to have persistent baseload electricity, right? Nuclear has none of that. It's zero carbon emissions. It's persistent. It's the most reliable source of energy because the plants are online 24/7 for 1.5 to 2 years, right? So it's a fascinating area. I think the challenge from a commercial standpoint has been that the paradigm that we've used, the pretty statist-focused paradigm in the United States, it's cost inefficient. And so if you look at, there was a kind of nuclear renaissance advertised back in kind of 08, 09. The budgets back then, they forecast with loan guarantees from the government. So, government financial subsidies, building a couple of new plants or reactors on an additional plant in South Carolina, and doing one that actually was the only one that got built, two reactors unrelated to the Tennessee Valley Authority, but the only private utility new reactor capacity that's been built in the last decade at Vogtle in Georgia. The Georgia base plant budget was $14 billion, which that's a lot of money, right? But the end price tag on it, if you throw in everything that it costs, is $35 billion. So you went $21 billion over budget on a $14 billion project for a power plant. That's a very, very, very challenging financial model, right?
Yeah.
And yet we need to get to a place where, if you look at AI data centers, right, where you have data center restrictions now. Northern Virginia is reevaluating their grid capacity. Arizona reevaluating grid capacity. And we need massive amounts of baseload electrification. And it's no coincidence that the hyperscalers are looking very closely at where can they get electric sources for data centers and AI. And the compute scale that you need for AI, and yes, AI is a little bit of the craze of the day, but it's going to be significant from just a transformational perspective. There's estimates out there. I saw one of the hyperscalers estimate publicly that the last model of AI that ran required 64 million in compute power. Well, 64 million in compute power, on one of the hyperscaler cloud infrastructures, yes, that's a lot of like semiconductors and software engineering time, et cetera. It's also just a lot of electricity, right, at scale. And the next models, they certainly will cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train, likely will exceed $1 billion to train per model. That's an enormous amount of electrical resources that we need, right? So you've got data centers, AI, electric vehicles, and then frankly, the base load of the population with climate change and, temperature extremes where you either need more heat or more air conditioning. And as you electrify some of those endpoints, then, just the base load from a population increase and what we need, even with efficiency gains and being prudent in our usage, still is so new nuclear, where you have better fuel sources, right? A more stable operating plant, getting away from water cooling, where you need massive amounts of seawater, which does two things. One, you're sucking up massive amounts of seawater, but two, you're locating nuclear plants like we have in California right on the coastline. So they tend to be more in earthquake prone or geographic risk areas. Or in the case of Fukushima, they're in a low-lying coastal area where they're susceptible to coastal flooding, right? And that type of technology. So, the new nuclear, which I don't consider like the '08 Renaissance, which is the legacy technology, but the true new nuclear technology, you have fuels that are encapsulated in ceramic, so it's hard for them to release. The real constraints on nuclear are cost, safety, waste, environment, non-proliferation, right, and fuel source. And new nuclear tries to address all that. Obviously, get the cost down. Safety is more encapsulated. It's more a fail-safe model. Waste still is a real issue. We're putting our waste for our current nuclear plants in dry cask storage at the site of where the nuclear plant is. That's not something that can last for 10,000 years. right? Which is essentially what you need, or 1,000 years at a minimum. And so we've got to figure out the waste part of the equation. Environment, we can figure out because you use less water. Non-proliferation, we don't use plutonium in the US for reactor operation, so that's less of a risk. And then the fuel source, President Biden actually yesterday or the day before yesterday has signed into law legislation so that Russia, effective August 11th, will not be a primary import source. The plants will not be able to import Russian uranium. So there are ways around it all, but it's just hard to imagine that with the massive electrical needs that we're going to need, our desire to decarbonize, our desire to clean up emissions, whether it's at the plant level or the vehicle, the tailpipe level, that nuclear is not just a complete core part of that strategy. And just to keep it at baseline, nuclear today, as we do this, 20% of this podcast electricity is coming from a nuclear source, on a nationalized basis.
Does your knowledge, obviously your impressive knowledge about nuclear energy, does that play into your M&A practice at all? Do you do nuclear deals at all?
Not really. There just, again, there's some supply chain stuff out there from a supply tail, whether it's in the defense sector, because there's obviously a large defense nuclear enterprise, and obviously civilian. But from a kind of design build, EDC is what's called, or first pour of concrete, I don't really play in that space from an infra financing. I'm a traditional kind of technology pure play M&A. The life cycle of the Silicon Valley company, right? You finance them with a preferred stock financing, you take them public on an IPO, and they get sold off, or they get super successful and they start buying other companies. So that's that life cycle that in the Valley, that's what we do.
Now, how did you end up kind of focusing on the M&A end? Did you decide you didn't want to do a lot of startup stuff, or do you do a lot of startup stuff?
So I don't do a lot of startup stuff. Candidly, I started out as an IPO lawyer, just because of the times in which I graduated law school was the dot-com boom, and I was literally doing an IPO a week, let alone and when the bust came, I ended up as a mid-level associate with a bunch of public companies who had huge piles of cash but no viable business model, which frankly is not terribly unlike some of the de-SPACs that we've seen in the past couple of years, right? As history repeats itself a little bit. But then I pivoted to M&A. I was a little intimidated at first, and as soon as I did my first M&A deal, I'm like, what's there to be intimidated about? This is actually really fun from a risk allocation perspective. There's a little bit of tension and practice, right? We're trying to be, I always tell junior associates, you want to end the deal where the other side says that person was an aggressive advocate for their client, but they made sense, they were logical, and they didn't create more friction than needed to happen, right? And especially going back to that point of it being a small valley, we see the same lawyers generally over and over again from many of the same firms, although the firm names have changed over time as lawyers have concentrated and the market's become more segmented, right? But it's still many of the same faces going back 20, 25 years. And so I love M&A, but I still do some late stage startup work. I think the challenge with early stage startup work is if you're at a top 10, 15 firm, the rates are such that, a lot of that work is NVCA form work. It's I don't want to call it commoditized per se, but you've got to do it with a high amount of leverage, paralegals, et cetera. It's just not something where we focus from a value add perspective. I tend to focus on, late stage startups that might encounter some bumps along the way, and a number of them do right before IPO, right? And then frankly, we do a lot of work for a couple of very large companies that are serial acquirers, and that's a totally different ballpark. And I love public companies because, first of all, the speed governor on a public company is twofold. It's the SEC and the enforcement division, for lack, to be blunt about it, and it's also the plaintiff's bar. So it's a little less of you as the lawyer having to be like, hey, if you don't do this, it's like everybody knows there's a maturity of doing it the right way. And then also from a technical standpoint, you get I tell everybody, you get two types of diversity. You get subject matter diversity within the public company, tax, HR, treasury, strategy, the CEO business level stuff, in detail, in real depth, because there's complexity, even just tax, international tax planning, how it works in the world, right? And then from an M&A perspective, you get diversity of the business in terms of what's going on. You're learning all the different facets of the business. So export control to what they do and how it applies to the various reps as you run through the agreement and the risk allocation, right? So as a junior to mid-level to senior associate, as you come up that pipeline of apprenticeship and increasingly leverage your skills as you're learning, I think it's a great place to learn about, businesses. whether or not it's tech or an entirely different sector. But it's a great way of learning about businesses, because ultimately, you're buying one and there's risks associated with it after the fact.
Yeah, interesting. Well, you've obviously had a super successful M&A career, military career. Do you ever see yourself doing anything else besides being a practicing lawyer?
I haven't. I've seen a lot. So I helped out a client part-time as a general counsel for a while I was a partner
Mhm.
at the same time. And it was interesting and different, but I really like being in private practice. I also like having different clients who are in different spaces, and again, learning different verticals.
Mm.
So I would never say never, right? That like life's too short to make grand judgments like that. But at the same time, I've had a lot of fun. And Silicon Valley has been, obviously a great place, and technology generally. Silicon Valley technology really isn't just Silicon Valley. It's a dispersed geographic entity now. But the culture, the way that the businesses are approached, that's something that's still somewhat unique and is enjoyable.
Well, Ed, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your taking the time. You have a super interesting background, and I really appreciate your taking the time to share it with me.
Great. Thanks, Richard.
This is Richard Hsu and Ed Batts. Thanks.